Well, welcome to Fisherville. My name is Peter Coffin, ranger with the John H. Chafee Blackstone River Valley National Heritage Corridor. Another was known as the corridor, the Blackstone Valley. Here is a map showing the boundaries of the watershed. That's how you define a valley. Every valley has a river running through the middle, and then from that ridge line, the highest point, water drains this way. This is the Blackstone heading down to Pawtucket and out into the ocean. You got the Charles over there, you got the Assabet going that way, you got the Quinnebog-Shetucket, the Blackstone. So it starts up about on Asnabumskit Hill. Where does it start? It starts here, here, here. But the highest point is Asnabumskit Hill. And then, depending on names, where does the Blackstone begin? Well, some people call it the Middle River, where the Tatanook Brook joins Kettle Brook, or where Mill Brook joins Kettle Brook in Worcester, at the south end of a big city. Do you think that affects the water quality in the river? Yes. And unfortunately also, just across the border in Millbury is the Upper Blackstone Water Pollution Abatement District, which is a regional sewage treatment. The good news is they do a great job cleaning the bacteria. They treat that for public health concerns, and that's the original concern for sewage treatment. They also do a good job with, they take industrial waste and some of the other stuff gets treated, but that's not what it's designed for. And it wasn't designed to treat for the nutrients. So that has just been dumped into the river for hundreds of years, and we're finding out that there are too many nutrients in this river. So here we'll see where some of the treatment, is it bunker oil that the treatment is for? Is it heavy metals or that we're concerned about? Is it PCBs? Not, the good news is it's not the real nasty stuff that other watersheds have. The historic sediments behind all the dams, chromium, cadmium, copper, lead, yes, but those aren't as volatile perhaps as elsewhere. Could be a lot worse. So tonight we're going to see some interesting cutting-edge technology going back to using nature to treat water. So that's the living machine here. That'll be at the end of the day. So where the Blackstone begins, it comes down, and where the Quinsigamond River, which is a major tributary, joins it, you could argue that the Blackstone really becomes the Blackstone right here in Fisherville. This is a major river. Before here, it's smaller streams. You get the water coming from Quinsig, major tributary. All right, it's at this spot, this becomes a bigger river. Also, what I should talk about this spot is the birds, migratory waterfowl. They travel up and down the seacoast. This is an international bird migration path that they would use the mill ponds and the reservoirs as resting spots to feed them on their way north and south as they migrate. So really an international resource here if you're a birder. And the interest of the state agencies to bring back Fisherville Pond. The Army Corps did a lot of work, some concerns with the sediments, but it's still a great resource. The corridor and others have been working on a bike path. That's going to come right along through here and then connect up. There's so much going for this site, for history, redevelopment of brownfields, getting on the river, canoe access here. There's a lot to be proud of, and I think in South Grafton there was a hole in here when the mill burnt down. So I should, for those of you who don't know, the mill was active through, well, before the Civil War. First textiles in the 20s and 30s, textiles moved south. It hung on doing a lot of, what were the different...
Tupperware was here for a while.
Tupperware, okay.
Press wheel making lawn chairs.
Making lawn chairs.
College, everybody worked there.
There you go. So it was industrial use, kind of abandoned. It was going to get taken over and bought by Central Mass and redeveloped, and then there was a fire. And then you're left with a shell of a building. And I live up the hill in Mendon. Floating in the air in my backyard was a little bit of old asbestos that the wind wafted down there. So this was a major pit, and 21E up and so that predated Gene. It sat there for a while. Bunker oil leaking constantly into the canal, booms put out, but they would just sit there for the longest time, and you felt sorry for all the turtles coming up. So a lot of people in Grafton pulled it together and made it happen. And with the help of a lot of state and federal monies, been able to do a great cleanup here. And this man has been known as a white knight because his technology's business has him cleaning up landfills. So he knew the science and wasn't too afraid of it, was willing to invest in the site, and has had the vision of using new technologies and mushrooms, and we can go in that whole 9 yards as to what he's invested in this site. And you'll kind of understand he's committed to this. And the town has worked with him and changed the zoning, but then the economy went south, and so he's still struggling with how to redevelop the site and make him an offer. But there is so much that can happen here. And so as a destination for tourism, I think the Chamber of Commerce is saying, no, you know, people are paying money to come and visit this. Are there jobs here? This was a hole in the community. You would walk by with a desert wasteland. It was a dumping area. Trucks would park here, raw dirt, this pile of bricks and refuse. This man had the vision and saw that he could make a bad situation better, and now he's here. So that's it for this general introduction. Gene, you want to say something? We're going to go up, take a glimpse of the mill village, and then come back down.
So just to add what Peter said about the river, we're actually on an island. You know, the property, the Fisherville Mill occupied, the property itself was 32 acres, and there's 16 acres that are south of 122 and 16 acres that are north of 122. On the west side of the site, you have the Blackstone Canal. On the east side of the site, you have the Blackstone River. So literally, you're on on an island. What we call this portion of it the peninsula, but you're on an island at the moment. The project, as we saw it, was pretty intimidating, but there was such broad public support for the vision that was created through the work of the Park Service, the EPA, Mass Audubon, and ourselves and the local community, that it was kind of a no-brainer to get involved in it. We have unanimous support in every town meeting that we've ever had for rezoning the site, for the construction of the park, for the entire concept of making, re-envisioning Fisherville as a destination for tourists, for education, for cultural activities, and that vision was kind of contagious. So everybody in the community believes it. We're starting to actually see it for a change. There's more and more people using the park. What we're doing here with the Eco Machine, we're now calling it the Living Systems Laboratory. It's designed to be a platform for classroom activities and for fundamental research into the way ecology works and how ecology can be used to clean up the environment, and how we can use the dirty water of the canal and the river to potentially make economic gain again out of the river by growing wetlands plants, native wetlands plants, and ornamental species where we don't need perfectly clean water. And we can then take that and use that as an engine for growth in the valley and provide a visual future for visitors, for children, of the potential of using contaminated waterways and trying to incrementally clean them up over time, and at the same time not look at it as like it's behind a fence. You know, this should be science in the front stage. You know, it's science first, culture is a part of science, learning is an everyday activity and a lifelong experience. So that's what we're hoping to create here with the Eco Machine and the Living Systems Laboratory. And we're also hoping that this becomes a nexus for social activities for the valley, a place where people will start to come and congregate. You know, we have the bandstand now, or the little area behind us here that is open for the public to use. And we're thinking about doing something on a grander scale like that on the north side of the parcel as well. So there's a lot happening here, and a lot will be happening here. We have 5 universities that are doing fundamental research with us here in the laboratory. We have the Worcester Technical High School that's starting to come in. We have AP science classes. We've hosted international tours from Belarus, the Ukraine, all people looking at, you know, where's the hope for the future? What are the solutions to the problems of the past? So the context for the project is the Blackstone past, present, and future. And the past is all around you. The present is what we're trying to do in the cleanup. And the future is how we use systems like this and sustainable concepts like this to drive our economy in a way and drive our world in a way that we're making it better all the time, not extracting everything we can from it and then moving to the south or moving out west, because there is no more away anymore. That was what the theory of operation was for the last 200 years, is throw it away. So the river was an open sewer. Providence got to deal with the result of that. Now we're all dealing with the result of it, and we all have to live in these communities. So figuring out ways that we can gradually change our environment. There is no money to do these wonderful, let's dig it all up and truck it away anymore. We have to come up with ways where we can live here and be involved and intimately involved with what's happening in our landscape.
South Grafton. Rode a bike anyway.
So as we walk by, I'll just point out the marker for the Blackstone Canal, showing where it was. We have these distributed throughout, some nice brass markers. There was of one of the mini locks, I think there were something like 46 locks. Lock number 30 was on the site here. We've dug around, it's no longer there. We think it got recycled. Those beautiful cut granite stones, I'm sure did not go to waste, but maybe were used and reused. So come on, here's that beautiful historic canal. Still holding water because it served the purpose after transportation canal. It was still used for providing water power. So the industry made sure the gate still worked. I think if you keep off to the side of the road, we'll walk up the edge here. Looking down the canal, you might see a slight sheen on the water. That's that little bits of the oil they've dredged out a little bit, but it's constantly leaking out of the banks. So this is the water that now is getting sucked up and treated and filtered.
The vision that was created for this site, and this was all through a public process. It wasn't just us, but in order to do these large-scale remediations, in public dollars that have been put into the site already is $10 million. In between this, and that's mostly just study. So $10 million to see what you see around you is $10 million, and that's part of the remediation above, which we put an additional $2 million into, as well as the public finance of the dredging of the canal, which was done last spring, and that's about it. So a lot of money goes a very little way nowadays. So one of the dialogues that we had to have right from the outset is that the vision of putting the mill back, which was what some people wanted to have, or having it being a public park, was really a non-starter, because there wouldn't be enough money. There isn't industry in the valley the way it was in the past. There is no money for public parks. So the site would never be cleaned up if that was going to be the vision that everybody was holding on to. So what was presented was a concept of a mixed-use development, which would be both commercial and residential space. Now, what we have approved for the site is 240 units of housing and 60,000 square feet of commercial space. And the concept behind the mixed-use development is what the state coined smart growth, which is, to bring people and their jobs back to where they live. So the theory is that just like in Europe, there are shops underneath where the apartments are. And that was the vision for the site. And at the time, in 2006 and 2007, when the real estate market was fantastic, it seemed like a great idea. Now, we're at 2013, we've spent millions of dollars collectively, and there isn't a market for that concept. So we're holding on to the zoning per se, because we hope that eventually this market will come back and there'll be a demand for that type of housing and mixed use. But where we're standing was supposed to be where most of the commercial space was. This was the original commercial district for, when this was an Agway building back when I was growing up and living here in town 50 years ago.
My husband that's where I met him, when I was getting grain for my horse. So she wouldn't be here if Bagway wasn't there.
So the idea was that 40,000 square feet of this would be commercial with 40 units of apartments above it. And that it would have a park view, and it would be looking across the park and across the canal, and the two zones would be dynamically connected. So what we were trying to do, and what is still the vision here, is recreate a village concept, and make it the engine of growth that the mill was, only in a different configuration. So the mill used to employ, when it was in full operation, I think 400 people. And all of the housing, which I think Peter's going to take up and show you, which still exists here, was to the mill was the center of the community, and that's the kind of the concept that's driving this. The development and the commercial space becomes the center of the community. That social spaces like the park and viewscapes that will be developed along the river and the waterfall become the draw, so that people want to live here. It's completely changing the character from a walled-off, fenced-off wasteland into a dynamic village with jobs and amenities here at the same time. So that's that's the goal here. And there is some traction right now. There's some discussion about potentially locating one of the Blackstone River Blackstone River visitor centers right here in this building. So that's being discussed with some of the local delegates or representatives, and there's some legs to that right now. So that would really put the place back on the map, literally, as a destination. So that, we need little things, incremental things, like we were talking about with the environment, incremental changes on the ground, like the park changed the dynamics of this site tremendously. So one little thing at a time. When we may not have that big splash, but we can do first, baby steps, and those baby steps turn into large strides.
Some of the heavier metals, but just about as far as we go. Yeah. All right, just a little transportation history. The canal, dug in 1826, opened up the Blackstone Valley, made all these mill sites accessible for industrial use. It only lasted 20 years. It gets replaced by the new invention of the railroad. I think the P&W was 1846 or 1848. They actually ran the railroad on the towpath in places. It was already flat, so the railroad follows very closely to the river in this section. Down there you can see that some of that beautiful historic mill villages. The two families, four families, long rows of worker housing. You got the old ball field in the back where the worker leagues would play baseball. Everything was walkable. The railroad was serious transportation. Turn of the century, you'd get on the train to go everywhere, and trolleys, and so this was a happening spot. You got Route 122A, 122, that's later when cars come in. So Main Street continues further on. You'd have the churches there. By this time, it's more than just congregational. You have a lot of immigrants of various cultural desires coming and taking those low-paying jobs, working in the mills. So it depends on what time period we're talking, which immigrants came in the 1880s, and then later more Polish after 1900, 1920. So you can track kind of the floods of the immigrants.
All the way to
It's a shot in the arm. It takes out half the eyesore, and this grows green. At least it's covered over. It's nothing on it. It's like a pile of bricks there for a while.
it was just a real manual.
Where's the pollution coming from? Textiles. Well, they would dye colors and then just let them run riot. but also there was steel works up in Worcester and some of the more heavy metals. This site, before Gene bought it, there was trichloroethylene. There was a plume. That's more modern stuff that's very volatile. It began after the fire. Was it because they used water? The plume went and impacted the South Grafton water. So now we got serious. EPA or DEP comes in, does the cleanup site. They figure out what they need to do to treat for that. It's stabilized. It still needs to be managed, but that's under control. Gene has fortified the dam and backfilled it, so that hopefully has solved most of that issue. The last one was this bunker oil that was leaking out, and you could have dug it all out. Traditional is scrape it all out, truck it out. Well, that's a historic resource there, the canal. Do you want to biff all that? So let's use this new technology, control it, dredge it out, and then capture it before it gets back in. So kudos to Gene and the state for kind of evolving as to how we treat these systems. That they get very expensive, and we have to try to be somewhat flexible depending on what the problem is. And unfortunately, it's a mixed soup of what the problem is. So now you can see what Gene is talking about. It's on an island. 122 crosses it. There's the vision of the recreated mill with a square made up, and then mixed use on the north side. On the south side, you've got more units, mixed use where we saw next to the Agway. And then on the peninsula, that's Stormwater Park, that there's many examples of new technology that can treat the runoff of our streets.
So the stormwater that runs down the street used to just discharge directly into the river, and that would take all the pet waste like we see on the sidewalk and just flush it, literally flush it down the toilet. So now the way this park was designed, runoff comes down the street, enters into the parking lot, and gets discharged into the rain garden and the detention swale right next to the greenhouse. And behind that are two other. There's one in this corner and one on the other side that are also detention swales for exactly the same thing. So we no longer have discharge of untreated stormwater going directly to the river. And the other vision of this was the stormwater, to look at historic infrastructure like the canal and say, okay, it's nice that it's historic, it's nice that it's the canal, but let's try and revision how we can use that. So the reuse of historic infrastructure, these old impoundments, the mill ponds, the canals, looking at those as potential parts of a treatment system, reinventing them, re-envisioning what they could be used as, that was a key component of what we're trying to do here. So the canal is an active part of the stormwater treatment system that's now in place for this little village. And it's a model that can be used on all industrial rivers around the country. There's lots of these impoundments where they had mill ponds and things. Well, you could re-envision those as treatment works rather than just a polluted pond. So incorporate them into an overall design, an environmental design that works to improve the area rather than just sits there and you lock it away, like I said, behind a fence.
Down in the center. And then we're going by all the time. Step in.
Yes. All right, if you come forward a little bit more, hopefully you can look upstream and get a good view of the Fisherville Dam. It is a beautiful stepped, cut granite. Now that is just part of the dam. The earthen embankment continues another 300 yards going the other way.
So the headworks of the canal.
And then there's a gate there that they used to be able to operate to bring water in and actually make use of that waterfall. Rather than wasting water going over the dam, they brought it through their power trench, made the wheels turn, and provide power to the mills. All right, now you can get some sense of the beauty of this river. It's really a beautiful spot. There's a boat launch. This is where you'd come and put your canoes. The river race started here originally. There's still the problem of portage downstream, but that's a beautiful section going down here. We got the Grafton Land Trust owning some land along the way. look, you see a lot of trees. There's not a whole lot of development still along the valley.
Yeah, so we have the peninsula, what we call a peninsula, is really a floodplain. So the flood water.
Question.
Sure.
Why do all these rivers, all the Blackstone, they all smell the same? They've all got that smelly.
Well, it's
to
a little
less of
rich.
extent.
It's a little
Is
nutrient.
Is it the pollution in there? Or
well,
what is
yes,
it?
yeah,
It's a little
too
bit
rich.
it's a couple of different things.
Every place you go, it all smells the same.
Ode to Blackstone.
Yeah, Ode to Blackstone, yeah.
Well, it's because a lot of it is because in order to control bacteria from the discharge of wastewater treatment plants, most treatment plants treat their final discharge with chlorine to kill the bacteria.
Yeah.
So what you smell is what's called an aromatic compound called a chloramine. It's just the compounds of the chlorine when they're mixing with the water as they fall down, cascade down the spillways like that, or when they're in rough water. Those all come up.
Get aired out again.
They get aired out again, but that's what controls the bacteria that keeps the water somewhat safe.
So that's a modern thing. I thought it was something smelly. We were
No.
smelling from all the
No, that's
dumping
the
into
goodness.
the dumping into the rivers all these years.
No.
Where most of the sediment, the real bad sediment, is at the base of the dam.
Well, it's always the
Behind the
sediments
dam.
are
Behind
always
the dam.
behind the dam.
Just have to have a little history here. The beautiful bank building that was moved here, restored, Gothic revival, early 1830s. So looked like a little temple of finance, the columns, the purity of white. Greece, the first democracy. We didn't want to depend on European style, so Greek revival was quite common in New England in the 1820s, 30s.
Oh, very cool. His great-grandfather was
Turn it over to Gene. For those of you, I don't know if you've heard of the New Alchemy Institute out of Woods Hole. Jonathan Todd has been a visionary thinker for 40, 50 years as to how to treat human waste so it's not a waste, that it's a resource and recycling. So Gene has teamed up with him and his son, and this is the culmination of how many generations? So Gene.
So I just wanted to start, the reason I wanted to start here is so you get an idea of this whole concept of stormwater, and it'll tie together with when we finish in the greenhouse. But as I said, the way, if you look up now, you can see the grade to the street, and the way that the street discharges right into the parking lot, and then you have this vegetated swale. The whole idea behind stormwater treatment is that there's, as much as possible, you don't want it discharging with this contaminants directly into a waterway. So vegetation is the key element of making that, to drop out the sediments, to absorb the nutrients that are in the water. The nutrients are the fecal matter, the poop from the dogs, the urine, and everything else that, lots of people walking pets every day. And that, that's a great thing to see. Sometimes they don't clean up after themselves, and that's true of every city along the Blackstone. So here, you funnel it through this vegetated swale, and it comes to these drainage basins, the two manhole covers right here. And then from the manhole covers, it discharges into this detention basin and rain garden. And you'll notice there's a kind of a change in the vegetation. So the vegetation up here is upland, mostly upland vegetation. So there's, you see the Rudbeckia, the brown-eyed Susan, the boxwoods, the spirea. I think there's ornamental grasses. Those can exist basically on any place where they can have wet feet, but they can't be submerged. The plants in the detention basin, the rain basin, they can all be submerged. And their role is, again, to absorb as many of the nutrients as possible before the water enters the surface waterway. So, and you'll see there's, so you've got one step right there where it drops one elevation, drops another elevation, and then you have what's a little check dam over here where the stone is before it discharges back out into the canal and riverway. Now, how this all relates is we're only using, in a system like this, we're only really using higher plants. There are no animals, there are no fungi per se. We didn't seed the system with mushrooms. There are no real big colonies of bacteria because there isn't enough water for them to exist. There's no root zones that are active. In other words, you're looking at the water travels over the surface. It doesn't penetrate or permeate through the roots of the plants where all the surface area is, where they can absorb the nutrients efficiently. So they're getting, the plants here are getting most of their nutrients from the soil. They're not necessarily pulling it from the water. So when we go through and you see the operating principle of the greenhouse, you'll understand why that's important and why this works so much better than this does. So let's say where the magic starts, or where the genius of nature starts in this system, is in these black tubes right below me right here. And you see them floating out into the canal here. At the end of these, there are packed gravel beds. They're like with crushed stone. And that we're sucking the sediments, the actual goop at the bottom of the canal, the worst of the worst. We're pulling that from here and we're bringing it into the greenhouse up above. And there in the greenhouse, we're using all what's really, to coin the phrase, is all the kingdoms of nature. So you have fungi, protozoan, bacteria, higher plants, algae, and animals all are present in the greenhouse, and they're all converting this waste, this toxic soup, into food for themselves to grow. And the whole genius of this system is to try and create an environment where each of those plants have a home, a habitat. So the whole goal of the system is to create as many different environmental conditions, as many different habitats as possible, and then let nature seed itself. This is a great example of kind of serendipity, which is a discovery just by accident. These are oil booms. They're supposed to absorb the oil from the surface. They're used in every spill from the Gulf of Mexico to Alaska, But what generally happens is they're placed out there, they absorb the oil, and then they're pulled out and disposed of. We're using a very different, this is a principle that you'll see echoed in the floating island, the floating restorer. You notice that even though these are oil saturated, they're covered with plants. Right? And all of those plants have adapted a capacity to live in that oily environment. And over the top of these plants, you can see how there's relatively, it looks like they're shiny at the top towards the back of this boom right here, the second boom. That's because turtles get up here and they graze the plants off the top of the booms. So you come down here any day, and you should stop down lots of different times and take a look at what's going on in the canal. It's amazing the amount of wildlife that's here. There'll be 70 or 80 turtles. No, I'm not kidding you. 70, 80 turtles on top of these booms, munching away on, sunning themselves and munching away on the plants. First thing I want to draw your attention to, outside you could smell the faint smell of oil, right? On a hot day, if you're by the canal, you can smell the oil. In here, you don't smell it. Right? And that's because all of the plants and animals in here are digesting that oil. And what we're doing is, we're trying to, like I said, create as many different habitats as possible for as many different organisms to survive. Because in nature, there's no such thing as waste. Human beings, they consider, that you have garbage that you produce, you throw it away. Well, nothing else in nature has that. Something urinates in the woods or it poops in the woods, there's some other animal that's using that as a food source to make itself into plant growth. So nitrogen in waste is converted into plant material. Right? So what's going on here is that we're using, as I said, all the kingdoms of nature, and the one that's really unique and is really important to to removing the oil are fungi, which are mushrooms that and really these are what we're using here are edible mushrooms. They're gourmet mushrooms, they're oyster mushrooms, they're these mushrooms called turkey tails that are now being researched for anti-cancer medication. We have another mushroom called a stropharia if you're Polish or you come from an ethnic background like I do, that people go out and collect mushrooms in the woods in the fall. They're wine cap. So the wine cap mushroom, you find them in wood chip beds everywhere. And the reason these are really important and what's unique about these organisms is that we all ingest, we eat our food and we digest our food internally. Right? And then we turn that into energy and food source for us. Mushrooms don't do that. They excrete enzymes. It's like they are constantly exuding enzymes, like a dew that's formed on each of these little one cell wide hairs. And that goes out into the environment and it digests the environment, and then they can absorb the simple compounds, the sugars, back in to make the body of the mushroom. Well, what these particular mushrooms that we chose do is they break down wood in the environment. And wood, when it's been sitting for millions of years underground, turns into oil. Right? So the same compounds that the mushrooms make to break down the wood breaks down the oil. None of the other organisms in here have that same capacity. Every other organism requires the kind of breakdown compounds, the simple sugars, that the mushrooms release into the environment. So mushrooms, fungi are keystone species. Literally every plant on Earth depends on the breakdown components. So in every plant, so every animal depends on the breakdown components of fungi. They evolved at about the same time as bacteria did. Some of the oldest organisms on Earth. And with oil, they do things that no other organism can do. So the way this works is we draw sediments from the canal, we discharge into these bins that are filled with wood chips and seeded with mushrooms. The mushrooms excrete their juices. The juices are collected along with the sediments from the canal, discharged into this green sump, and then sent into the tank, into tank number 1. And right here, what's happening is you see through these things, we certainly don't have to fertilize. All of these plants are growing very healthily on the river water with no added nutrients to it. So if you were in a hydroponics, if you know what that is, where you grow your vegetables in water, hydroponics, you add a lot of fertilizer. Blackstone River water doesn't need that, so we got very healthy growth. And you'll see, if you look at some of these plants here, and what I wanted to bring you back to thinking about with outside, is some of these plants are ornamentals. This is a wetland hibiscus. Right here, you have beautiful white flowers. Now the greenhouse is about 3 weeks ahead of the restorer in the canal. So all the flowers that are here we'll see out on the canal restorer within a couple of weeks. So even though these are ornamental plants, they're all serving that same purpose of recycling food, taking nutrients out of the environment. And what I was talking about with surface area, when we were looking at the sediment basins and only the surface of the water gets treated, the water's not flowing through the roots. I'll try and lift these up, but they're really heavy. If you look at these mats, these are all floating mats. If you can see, let's see if I can get it here. See the root hairs? Each one of those root hairs is a home for a bacteria or an algae that's breaking down the waste in the water. So when water, if you imagine water flowing across the surface of the vegetation, sure, it's removing some of the sediment, but it's not taking up all that contamination in the water. The roots are where all of the action is. And what you can see here as we go through the tanks, which gives you kind of a graphic demonstration, is that, see these tanks being dark water. Look at the last tank. Filters through the steps. So when we take in the water, it's contaminated with oil, contaminated with phosphorus and nitrogen. When we discharge the water, it's close to drinking water standard. So we've been able to reduce the hydrocarbons, the oil in the water by 95%, the nutrients by over 99%. So this little system here shows you really the genius of nature, what nature can do. So.
I mean, it's positive use for purple loosestrife.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Well, purple loosestrife. The other thing here, when we seeded this environment, okay, we used only native, non-invasive plants.
Yeah.
Okay.
That got in there.
And that gets in here. So, that's the kind of nature hates a vacuum. The whole concept is with this greenhouse is to use native environments, native plants. And we used fungi that were specially selected for this purpose. Within a few weeks of doing pure culture, where we did in a lab, we do it in a test tube where we grow the organisms and then introduce them into the wood chips. Within a few weeks of them being introduced to the greenhouse, they have 5 other competitor organisms in there with them. So in a way that's a failure, in another way it's a real success, because what it means is that you're creating this food source for all these other organisms. So that primary organism that you introduced was successful at breaking down its environment to the point where some other organism could use its byproducts.
But that purple loosestrife will take that whole thing over.
It's amazing. That's been in here, but it's not taking it over.
Oh, I pulled up one plant. I couldn't.
Oh yeah, they're an
like
invasive.
A tree. It was
Yeah,
like a
they're an
tree
invasive. There's no question they're an invasive, and we're trying not to have those here. But one of the other things that we're talking about in reinventing this concept of Blackstone past, present, and future is there a way to turn lemons into lemonade? And say that let's take that dirty water, and we're going to use that dirty water for a productive use. So if it can grow these plants this way, it can grow the rudbeckia, which are paying $8 or $10 a pot for in a perennial garden. It can grow the wetlands hibiscus. It can grow the horsetail, again, very expensive plant. And we're going to be growing those plants now in the trays above here and turn this into a wetlands nursery, as wetlands plant nursery for native plants, as well as clean up the water. So that gives you an idea, kind of re-envisioning what these treatment systems are like. Say, it's not just about treatment. The idea is to become engaged with how nature works and then figure out how we use nature in a way to make products that are valuable to us. So we can grow ornamentals in water from the Blackstone. We're not going to grow our food in it, but the biggest agriculture in Massachusetts, the biggest industry in agriculture is ornamental plants. It's not food. So it's the potential of doing that. We can grow koi and goldfish in Blackstone River water. People aren't eating them, but there's a high demand for them. You can grow bait fish, which we have a huge supply of, minnows in the canal. All of those things can be done with this water that we're all saying we have to stay away from. So the whole idea here is how do we, it's creating an alternative vision of the future that says, okay, it's not behind a fence, it's not something we have to be afraid of, it's something that we can be engaged with, and we can, work with and figure out how we get our livelihoods from it. Just the way the mills did at the very beginning, using it for raw power. Now, there's all kinds of uses for the river water.
Does this cost much to run this, though?
No. And energy cost.
It's not solar, right?
It is.
Oh,
if
it
you
is
look,
solar.
it's
greenhouse.
but it is solar. It's solar in another way too. It has a thermostat that controls the temperature in the greenhouse, but it controls it by ventilation. So those panels, that panel right there, and there's a panel up above you, right? It will close and open automatically depending on the temperature in the greenhouse.
So what happens in the winter?
It closes. And then what we do is we have a propane backup, and that runs maybe once or twice a month, even in the coldest of the winter, because we don't need to keep this, beautifully green. We just need to keep it alive. So we keep the temperature in the greenhouse in the winter at between 45 and 50 degrees.
So they don't go dormant then?
They don't go dormant, no. And that's part of, that's why we'll finish this tour, because that's part of what we're trying to do here, is that because of fluctuations in the water quality, because of fluctuations in the velocity of the water, the contaminants in the water, what happens is a stable environment starts to develop, right? And then you have one of these horrendous flood events or a rain event. And all that bacteria that was there, that was doing the work, and all those plants that were there were doing the work that you want them to do, is all of a sudden it's down the river. Or it's upset and there's a catastrophic event that kills them. So what the greenhouse function is, it's a refuge. So it creates this stable environment that's somewhat controlled, has the same environmental conditions, contaminants, but it's somewhat controlled, and it allows us to reintroduce the bacteria and the ecosystem, this engineered ecosystem that's developed here, gets reintroduced back into the canal. So that same material, that same plant mass that we have in there with the root zones hanging down, that's what's going on in here. Except we're taking the water that has all the bacteria and organisms that are the microorganisms that are growing in the tanks, and we're reintroducing them out here. So we know they're working in there at reducing the hydrocarbons. So the idea is to create a stable population, so there's a feedback loop between what's happening in the greenhouse and what's happening in the environment outside. You know, like I said, it's the law of unintended consequences. When the mills were operating, they weren't thinking, oh, we're going to leave a toxic legacy for everybody that comes after us. They were thinking, I'm providing food for my family and food for my workers. And they didn't really, you know, there was no such thing as, you know, pollution wasn't even considered. You know, the river was a resource because it moved waste away from the mill. It powered the mill and it moved waste away from the mill. It's an unfortunate legacy that we deal with, but there's no reason that we can't figure out how to re-envision how it's used in the future.
They had the outhouse near the well, too.
Well, on that hopeful note, I want to thank Gene for doing such a great job.
Really?
Well, they weren't mixing chemicals in it.
Doing all their work.
But things that we
And
just
coming
say,
out
oh,
tonight,
come on,
and he could
but
be
that's
at
what
home
they
with
did.
his
I had
Would be on the profit.